Ladies and gentlemen, we're glad you could join us on this special edition of Business Redefined. As always, this is your premium platform where we unpack everything business, finance and economics. This morning, the finance bill dropped, and ever since we have been inundated with questions as to what this means for households and for businesses. And for the sake of getting everyone on the same page, the finance bill is a document which, according to the PFM Act, provides that in the budget cycle of this country, by the 30th of April, every year it shall be submitted by the National Treasury to the National Assembly, and alongside that will be the draft budget estimates. Why those two documents are important is because on the one hand we have the expenditure side, and that's the draft budget estimates. On the other hand we have the revenue side, and that is the finance bill, because it gives us insight into what Treasury is proposing as ways of raising the projected revenue. Now for the financial year 2023-24, that's between July and June next year, the government targets raising 2.8 trillion shillings. And if you have come to the finance bill, the document is ambitious. I'm delighted to be joined on set with James Mulili from PKF. Welcome on set, sir.
Thank you, Julian.
My second guest is Robert Orero. Maybe he needs no introduction here. Robert, glad to have you on set.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Gentlemen, let's start from here, and let me start with you, James. When you come through the finance bill, what are your immediate thoughts? Are you happy?
I can say I'm really trying to wrap my head around it. And I now understand why the CS National Treasury said that they needed a little bit of extra weeks to come up with the finance bill, and I think it's evident as we'll go through it.
Yeah.
There are actually a myriad of tax amendments that are proposed, and we'll actually see what that means, because some of these amendments are not something that we really expected.
Yes.
But we understand, like you've mentioned, it's a humongous 2.8 trillion budget. The money has to come from somewhere.
All right.
Yeah.
Robert.
Yeah, Julian, I agree with James here that it is definitely a heavy document. And just to put it in perspective for our viewers, if you look at the Finance Bill 2022, it had 53 sections. The Finance Bill 2024 has got 84 sections. So already that tells you that this is a much more complex document than we are used to. And so there's a lot to unpack in this bill, and I think it presents a very good opportunity for the public to now interact and interrogate some of these proposals, so that eventually we come up with something that is workable for the common mwananchi. But I have to say that it is a very detailed proposal document.
All right, so let's get into the meat of it. And the first thing which stood out to me when I was coming through it early in the morning, by the way, I put out a thread on Twitter. You can check out at AmbokoJH for the breakdown of the 10 things which I think everyone needs to know about the finance bill. Let's start from here. The 35% being proposed for 500,000 shillings per month and above. I've received tons of questions as to the implications of this, the import of this as well. So let me start with James. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so on this proposed amendment, I think the way it will be received by Kenyans will be in varying contexts. If you look at a majority of the taxpayers, it's actually pay-as-you-earn is actually one of the biggest collections, and it's because of the mandatory requirement by employers to actually deduct and remit the pay-as-you-earn on behalf of the employees. And the reason I'm saying it will be met with varying reactions is because, remember, the pay-as-you-earn rates
yes,
vary from 10% up to the current 30%.
Yes.
And you see the brackets will cascade, and the higher rates would be applicable on those employees who earn higher incomes. And that's why I've said, you will notice that if you look at basically the cascading of the amounts that are received by employees, a majority of the employees, based on the last statistics, earn not more than 100,000.
True.
So they're on the lower bracket.
Yeah.
So we have a very sort of small proportion that will actually hit the 35%. And you see, to some extent, it's a good measure, because there's a cushioning of those employees who are earning less. But then you see there's a cry on the high earning employees who are getting more than 500,000 Kenya shillings per month. So obviously that's an additional 5% on basically that would be a top up in terms of revenue collection. As to what that will translate, I think statistically it would be difficult to have the exact number of the employees who would earn such amounts, but then I think it will contribute towards the budget in terms of just trying to meet the deficit.
Robert, one of the key questions we've received around this issue is when President William Ruto assumed office, one of the things which he currently talked about is that we are overtaxing trade and undertaxing wealth. And he said, in our first legislative proposal as far as taxation is concerned, we'll be coming up with measures to tax the high-income guys a lot more. Is this one of it?
Well, I think, Julian, that could be one of it, because if you think about it, and like James says, it's definitely an unexpected proposal in the sense that we've never had that tax rate of 35% for employees. Now, for me, there are two key points that I just want to make around this. The first one is the effective date, because that's an important point to consider. Yeah. The effective date is 1st July 2023, which means that if this proposal sails through, the July paycheck will definitely contribute a lot more to the exchequer from this particular tax at PAYE.
Yes.
Now, as to, if you were to look at the regional parity, if you go to Uganda, for example, their top tax rate is 40%. And you hit that top tax rate at about 4.4 million shillings annually. Yeah. Now, Kenya's is about 6 million. 6 million. So, you know, there's some sort of comparison there. If you go to Ethiopia, for example, the top tax rate is 35%. But then that, you hit at a very, very low margin, very, very low threshold of 131,000 shillings per annum. So it's not entirely unexpected if you are to look at regional you know, countries or comparisons. However, I think this is definitely one of the measures that the president was looking at when he says we need to show up our tax contributions. And I think the thinking here is if you earn more, then suddenly you would be in that class of wealthy people who we should be taxing.
All right. One of the things which stood out for me when I was reading through the finance bill is just the tone of the document itself. And by the tone, I mean this. There is a sense in which GOK needs to receive tax remittances with urgency. Yes. Unlike preceding finance bills we have seen in the past. And I say this having read quite a number of them. Because increasingly you are seeing, for example, excise tax remittance by betting and gaming companies. It is now anchored in law, rather, it will be anchored in law if this finance bill sails through in the present form, that the remittance should be within 24 hours. And it widens it to say the commissioner has the latitude for any other sector which has excise on services, they can demand within 24 hours. What does this speak to, James?
Yes. Now, on that particular issue, there's the legal aspect of when taxes fall due.
Correct.
And then if you look at an example, excise duty, the obligation really to account for the excise duty is by the 20th of the subsequent month. Now, legally, then what does that mean? In as much as if this sails through, there'll be a provision in law that actually mandates all these entities that, for example, the betting companies, to make sure that that remittance happens almost in real time.
Yes.
And then this way, I think just to echo your sentiments, the government seems to want the money here and now.
Correct.
And that, to me, raises a lot of concerns in terms of cash flow-wise, because that urgency in itself raises so many questions. And obviously, bearing in mind the fact that, remember the way businesses are run. In as much as you've made a supply, it's not automatic. And actually, I think in almost 99% of the cases, you will not collect the payment from your customer on immediate basis, especially where you are dealing on a sort of a business-to-business basis. So does that mean then businesses have an extra cash flow constraint in terms of, I've not been paid by my customer, I have an obligation within the next 24 hours of making the supply to remit the excise duty, as an example. So how will businesses be able to fund this tax upfront? There could be an argument to the contrary to say, even if the timelines talk of by the 20th of the subsequent month, it does not say that the payment has to be made on the 20th. So if you made a supply, for example, on the 20th of March, it does not mean you have to wait until the 20th of April to make the payment. So it is arguable, but you see the facts are facts. And you see there are commercial decisions that have to be made. Will entities be forced to borrow to be able to meet this high threshold? Maybe just to touch on the issue of this rollout being applicable to the betting companies. Yeah. This is because this has been piloted, and there are systems that are in place to make sure that that happens. So the practicality really of extending this to other products that are excisable will have sort of to undergo a similar process, it will take time because there are challenges in the first place to even administer excise duty on certain products like cosmetic products and beauty products.
Yes.
And the funny thing is, one of the things, sorry to say this to the ladies, something like the artificial nails, excisable products now.
Yes, at 5%, by the way.
And the challenge is, how do you affix an excise stamp to a nail? So those are really the challenges in terms of how will this rollout be done. But I think the biggest concern that a business will be faced with, you need to finance this if this sells through.
Okay.
Yeah.
Robert, still on the same point, and really just to nuance it a little further, is that if you look at the excise revenue pie, players like banking and telecommunication services increasingly are taking a slightly larger piece of it. Do you think the further provision that in any other sector where services are excisable, the commissioner can demand within 24 hours simply puts on the radar players like those ones, banks and telcos?
Absolutely, Julian. And you know the Swahili have a saying for that. Ukiona kichwa cha mwenzio kichanolewa, nawe chako tia maji. So I think for those sectors, it's very clear that it's a question of when, not if, that this will come into place. And just to progress that point further, we're talking about excess duty. But if you look at Section 35 of the Income Tax Act, even withholding tax will now be due within 24 hours.
Yes.
And so my sense is that government has been piloting this, and as James says, they have done it with the betting sector. They are now going to other sectors of accessible sectors, and then now they have gone to income tax. So really, it's also a question of time before when Nation Media Group pays your salary, some amount hits your bank account, and the POIE hits KRA's bank account. And really, this is where the world is going with the real-time reporting. It's been done in Russia, it's been done in the UK, it's been done in Ireland, and so it's not really something that is new. Okay. It's something that we should be expecting.
Still on the subject of excise, one of the things which I think is a big win, and we've been talking about this for a long time, is the question of inflation adjustment of excise duty being done on an annual basis. So if you read the finance bill, it is proposing that Section 10 of the Excise Duty Act be rescinded, or rather be repealed for that matter. But here's my question. It is a global practice that excise duty is actually inflation adjusted. So I was expecting that it would have indicated it is done either every 3 years or every 2 years. I remember having a conversation with the Association of Manufacturers last year, and they said once every 5 years. But now that it is just blanket that we are repealing it, James, where does that leave us?
Yeah, and that begs the question is the national tax policy dead on arrival?
Yeah.
And the reason is because, and actually to put into context what we are grappling with the proposed amendments even in the finance bill, we are looking at very radical amendments that create a lot of uncertainty to businesses and to investors. Because then it's a matter of this budget cycle, these are the amendments.
Yes.
What is the potential or likelihood of having another radical discussion at this same time next year?
Yeah.
And the national tax, the draft national tax policy was subjected to public participation. We are still waiting for the final outcome of that. And you see that unpredictability and the fact that yes, we could be looking at a situation where there's a proposal to do away with the inflation adjustments, which sort of deviates from the global practice. But remember, this is just the initial stage of the laws making process.
Yeah.
These will be subjected to public participation. Stakeholders will be invited to make submissions, and it's not unusual. We have seen some things come in and trickle in the Finance Act. So yes, it appears to be a welcome move in terms of just trying to contain that erratic adjustment of excise duty in terms of inflation. But I guess it's a matter of wait and see on the 30th of June.
Robert.
Yeah, I agree with James here that that stability and that predictability of the tax system is a very welcome move, especially for the businesses which are affected by excess duty. But just to point something out on the excess duty amendments, Junians, you see, this annual inflation adjustment, it's not, it doesn't generally apply on a yearly basis. And the rationale here is this. Excess duty is levied either ad valorem, which means as a percentage of the value, or specific, which means X amount of shillings per unit of measure, maybe it's a liter or whatever. And so what governments will normally do is that they will project and say, within this 2 to 3 year period, this is how much we want to collect. And then that obviates the need for an annual adjustment. The problem that we've been having with annual adjustments is that you've got an adjustment that comes in the Finance Act 2022, and then an adjustment in October for the annual inflation adjustment, and then another adjustment in June 2023. And so that creates 3 adjustments for the same product in 1 year. Yeah. I doubt whether the market could have accommodated further adjustments. So personally, I'm very happy about that, because it also makes administration of excise duty much easier when you don't have to track these adjustments almost every 4 months.
Okay. And now that you mentioned the national tax policy, which the last I saw was still in draft format, there was a proposal that to create predictability and stability within the excise taxation regime, the policymakers would be able to guide on the products which would be subject to excise. When you read the finance bill, do you feel we are walking closer to that envisioned end or further away from it?
No, I think we are, because, and I think generally the application of excise duty on various commodities and products is always guided by a schedule. And basically the first schedule and second schedule to the Excise Duty Act. Yeah. So you'll find there is that specificity in terms of listing the product and specifying to a large extent even the HS code, which is basically the unique identifier of the product. Yeah. And as Robert has mentioned, the duty rates are of 2 types. It's either a percentage of a value, or it's a unit of measure. Yes. That you apply a specific rate on. So yes, there is specificity, because there is never that generality in terms of application. There have been challenges over the years in terms of the form and substance of some of these products. And a good example was, I think, in the alcoholic and beverages sector. Yes. There was an introduction in the market at some point of some powdered beers. There was an introduction of some kinds of fresh juices that came in the form of some puree of sorts, and had to be sort of, you had to put some water in it to make it into a finished product. Yes. And the question is, if you look at the description that was there in law and the variation in the substance and form, then becomes a challenge. Is this the same product, or is this a different product? Because if you go to the HS categorization under the East African Community Common External Tariff book, you will notice that those are 2 very distinct products. Yeah. But then you find that the interpretation in terms of application by KRA, they always say this is a similar product. Another challenge we've seen is an amendment in law, and in the interest of protecting the local industry, they introduce words like, these will only be applicable on imported items of this tariff. Yes. Now, interpretation also comes from the Revenue Authority that even locally manufactured products are the same. And this is typical of something that happened in the last budget cycle for guys who manufacture plastic bottles. Yes. There was a discussion, and the Hansard actually recorded that it is only articles of plastic of a particular tariff that are imported that will be subjected to excise duty. Yeah. But in terms of application, KRA wakes up and says excise duty is applicable on all plastic articles, whether locally manufactured or imported. And it crystallizes into a dispute, despite the fact that the law is clearly worded, yes, that there is the word imported before description of the product. I see. Yeah.
Robert, speaking about beverages, whether alcoholic or non-alcoholic, I think this is the first finance bill I have read where I think those players will catch a breather. You know, and I was asking myself that is this an indication that finally Treasury could be heeding the advice that, you remember the conversation we always have about the Laffer curve, that you can continue slapping excise duty on these products, but at some point it flattens out and then the yield begins declining. Did you get the same sense when you read it? No, absolutely. And I think that government must have, and you know, you've got to remember that the CS National Treasury, his background is, he's an econometrician. Yeah. He studies this kind of things, the Laffer curve. So my sense is that they must have looked at the performance of excess duty on this particular sector, the alcoholic or beverages sector, and looked at the
progressive yield even as they increase the taxes. And then you compare with other countries like Tanzania, where the excess duty rates are much lower, yet for an almost equal market size, they are collecting much more.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I got. And then just to build up on the point of excess duty, I think government has now come out fully in the open to say excess duty is just no longer a sin tax now. It's going to be a mainstream revenue-raising tool.
True.
And if you followed the president's speech, I think it was last year's Taxpayers' Day, you know, he questioned why is it that we are selling X number of stamps, yet other countries are selling, you know, Y number of stamps. And part of the explanation for that was that in Uganda, for example, they impose excess duty on cement. Now in Kenya, we are imposing excess duty on cement. So it's very clear that we are borrowing from what other countries have done. And like James says, you know, things like artificial nails, weaves and,
yes,
and that kind of a thing. So I think that the key question here will be enforceability of that provision, because we know, I mean, I don't know how we are going to do insert the tax stamps on the fake nails. I don't know how it's really done, but you can clearly see some administrative challenges in terms of implementation of this. But the whole idea is we're going to use excess duty to drive more revenues for this country.
Okay. One of the things which I found to be a very serious shocker in this finance bill is when you come to the subject of turnover tax. So two things. First is that the band is being restructured. Presently, if your turnover is between $1 million and 50 million, the proposal is to scale it down to 500,000 shillings to 15 million shillings. And the question that is being asked here is the mission to push more companies to the corporate tax level? And for that matter, more small, medium, and potentially micro companies, James?
That looks like is the intention. But then, in my view, I think it is detrimental. And maybe I can explain why.
Yeah.
You see, the turnover tax regime has always existed to try and sort of cushion and enable these small businesses to develop over time. It is obviously anticipated that a small business that is able to manage its taxes at a very low level from an income tax point of view, with time will grow and will outgrow the turnover tax bracket. Now, what does this speak to the promotion of these small businesses? But you see, also someone can also argue these small businesses also have a lot of money. But then you see, that is not the point. The point really is how can the government incentivize small businesses to turn formal? And I think that was the intention of turnover tax in the first place.
Yeah.
And if you look at the motions that go through, the question has always been, any small business with a turnover of less than 1 million, then implicitly is sort of exempt from income tax.
Yeah.
Now, when the bracket was expanded from 1 million to 50 million Kenya shillings, it was around the COVID time. It was just now to encourage more businesses at least to fall within the bracket and pay some tax. But something else that also came with it was the obligation to account for VAT for these small businesses. Because remember, the previous threshold was up to 5 million Kenya shillings, which was below the VAT registration threshold.
Yeah.
So my suggestion would be for the government to stop taking a very myopic approach in terms of quick revenue collection by pushing these small businesses to the 30% corporate income tax regime. There is still a VAT. Some of these small businesses, you'll be shocked, are doing big time excisable product sales. So if you look at it in basically, if you look at the bigger picture, there is still some income tax, there is still VAT, there's still excise duty. These small businesses, you're enabling them to employ a lot of people. There is some pay-as-you-earn that you're getting out of it. So I think the government should really consider, at least for the time being, maintaining that bracket, especially during these harsh economic times.
Okay.
Yeah.
Robert, the argument has been leveled that, look, before you start raising a tantrum here, the band 1 million to 50 million is just too wide. Government had to really rethink this.
Yeah, and I think that's really a valid concern for government, because, you know, 1 million to 50 million, that's very wide. And I think when you had the CS National Treasury saying that we have applied ourselves and we want to expand the tax base, I believe part of that expansion of the tax base is narrowing that gap, and at the same time also increasing the turnover tax rate from 1% to 3%. So there's a double win here for government, because you then collect a little bit more, and like James says, there are a lot more guys who you push to the 30% corporation tax. So at a subliminal level, government will be collecting an additional 29% if you're going to pay tax at 30%. So I think that's what I would say about that. But it's also important to understand that most of these COVID measures, like James has indicated, were reversed in short order, actually. Yeah, they were reversed in December.
December, yes.
Yeah. So for me, this review of the bans didn't really come as a surprise, because it's one of those provisions that had survived the two amendments, that's 2021, 2022, and now is being revisited in 2023. But I do expect that National Treasury's perspective is, guys, we have incubated you for a significant amount of time. Now please pay your dues to the Exchequer.
Someone asked me that given the nature of businesses which fall within the ambit of turnover tax, what are the odds that hiking the rate from 1% to 3% could yield the perverse outcome that they push a lot of their transactions to be cash-based?
Yeah. So Julians, yes, there is that potential, and it is possible that the change of mode of payment could be influenced by this decision to push these businesses to the 30% regime. Is it something that is inevitable or fully within the government's control? I would say no. You must have seen a lot of efforts by government to actually try and sort of integrate financial information data to the iTax system. The conversation about efforts and initiatives to make sure that there's access to mobile money transactions, the never-ending persistent push for the KRA to get access to bank account information. And this is so that the government can have a visibility as to the velocity of the movement of money.
Yes.
And you see, that data and that statistic is very important. But are we looking at a situation where a heavy push by government will start forcing businesses to rethink? I actually want to be under the radar. Let me do my transactions in cash. Yes.
I see. Robert?
Yeah, I mean, you can't rule out that perverse outcome of a rate hike. However, I think what the National Treasury or the executive has also done in anticipation of that risk, they are saying, look, we're going to amend Section 16 of the Income Tax Act so that if Julian's doesn't give you an invoice that has gone through the tax invoice management system, then that will not be an allowable expense for you for tax purposes. And so I think what's going to happen from that is that formalized businesses will not want to deal with somebody who is not playing within the rules and therefore giving me a tax compliant invoice. And that provision, that amendment to Section 16 of the Income Tax Act has also been supported by a similar amendment to under the Tax Procedures Act, which requires anybody who is in business to issue an invoice which is coming from this device. And remember, from the VAT experience, this device is supposed to transmit on a real-time basis.
Correct.
So I think when KRA finally gets all this data, and they're going to be collecting a lot of this data, when they finally get this data, I think it's really a question of time before they start smoking out those people who have gone cashless or who have gone, have gone back to hard cash in terms of transacting. So there is a risk, but I think there are procedures in place that are being put, or provisions in place that are being put to ensure that that is minimized.
All right. And that point by Robert Orero takes us to a short break. We shall be right back with a lot more on this conversation, focusing on the finance bill. Now, when we come back, there is this contested issue of pay to play. We'll be unpacking that. Stay tuned.
Hi there, my name is George Washuri, Optiven, and we are very happy as Optiven introducing to you Achievers Paradise Gong. We are calling you to be part and parcel of the fastest growing satellite town in this city. Optiven is doing water reticulation, nice fence, tree planting, solar street lighting, beautiful, well-compacted Maramu roads, and we are developing and building a beautiful Achievers Gate. This is a chance that you cannot afford to to miss. Call this number 0790 300 300.
We asked Kenyan women to tell us what they look for in a lotion.
Leo tunaweka kwenye jaribio body lotion ya bei ghali na ya bei nafuu. Why pay more? Nunua Nice and Lovely body lotion. Ni bora zaidi kwa bei nafuu. Inai-transform dry skin kuwa deeply nourished na kui-smoothen.
It's just nicer and lovelier. Chagua Kenya's #1 body lotion.
Jumini get actress. Nadhani sina insecurities. Kuna body parts si kwa itaka zionekane. Lakini after kutumia Nice and Lovely Flawless Bio Body Oil, results nazo. Nime-reclaim my confidence na nika-fade away my fears. New Nice and Lovely Flawless Bio Body Oil. Imeboreshwa na 4 natural oils. Kupunguza stretch marks, ku-even skin tone, na ku-improve firmness. Flawless is a feeling.
9 out of 10 Kenyan women agree it worked for them.
Mtoi amepewa 3 days alipe school fees. Gadhani mara ngapi nimekuambia tupeleke mtoi shule ya gava na utaki kunisikiza. Unaisisa hapo mpeleke shule ya private na hata hauna pesa. Shika.
Start your life here.
It's not enough for me. It's just not enough.
You don't know what they do to girls like you.
I think it's Avina. Cindy. That's her name.
Sorry, who is your father?
That's a couple bells. Dad had another family. Another wife.
How do you keep your toilets clean?
I use normal detergent and bleach for washing.
The detergent and bleach cleanless can leave behind yellowness, rust, and germs.
Harpic's 10 times better cleaning compared to regular detergents and bleach, and kills 99.9% illness-causing germs in your toilet, including the COVID-19 virus.
You do your best out there. Let us do our best in here with the disinfecting power of Jake. Because Jake cleans and kills 99.9% of illness-causing germs and COVID-19 in your home. Jake, your family's guardian against germs and COVID-19.
This is NTV.
NTV News Headlines in association with Diamond Trust Bank.
Tonight, the Kenya Kwanza tax plan, a bittersweet agenda. Higher income tax for some, increased turnover tax amid some reliefs. We take you into the finance bill. Also tonight, more post-mortem evidence pointing to murder in Shakahola.
We found 2 who had head injuries, meaning that they had been injured to they died because of blunt trauma to the head.
More rescues in the alleged cultic horrors in Kilifi. Celebrations follow preacher Ezekiel Odero's bail ruling. And 12-year-old boy shot and killed as police in Wajir take on protesters decrying alleged extrajudicial killings.
Waliua mapema watu vile tulisikia na wakalete jioni.
This is a serious matter. We will not sit down and watch.
NTV journalist clobbered by police as he covered the demos.
So this is what's happened. I've identified myself and the police officers are familiar and the people, I know them.
Plus, a struggling economy, a government that must borrow to stay afloat, and the watchful eye of the International Monetary Fund. Front and center tonight.
NTV News Headlines in association with Diamond Trust Bank.
All transactions with DTB are secure. Being like a net where safety nets means you can bank from anywhere at any time. Achieving more for you is the least we can do. Because at Diamond Trust Bank, you don't just bank with us, you bank on us.
My skin is my identity, my strength. It's unique and deserves care made specially for me. New Nivea Radiant and Beauty Advanced Care with 5 oils and 5 vitamins. 48-hour nourishment. Helps reduce appearance of stretch marks in just 2 weeks. New Nivea Radiant and Beauty Advanced Care for your shade of beautiful.
Getting hold of a playful baby to change their diaper can be difficult. With Molfix pants, changing diapers is now very easy. I tear and take off the used Molfix pants and pull the new one up in a moment. wrap up the used diaper and throw it away. Me and my baby are very happy. This is how the Molfix happiness movement spreads. Come on, mothers, try Molfix baby pants and be part of our happiness movement.
Start your life here.
It's not enough for me. It's just not enough.
You don't know what they do to girls like you.
I think he's having an affair. Cindy. That's her name.
Sorry, who is your father?
That's a couple bell. Dad had another family, another wife.
Oh, you're here.
Friends becoming family. Home-cooked meal, ice-cold Coke. That's the recipe for magic. Make your mealtime more magical. Buy any participating pack. Check under the cap to get your code and stand a chance to win free food shopping for a year, plus millions in instant cash, airtime and shopping vouchers.
Own your dream home for as low as 1.98 million Kenya shillings in Vipingo Kilifi. SMS Vipingo to 22365 or call us today on 0740 400 215. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome back to this special edition of Business Redefined. We are unpacking the Finance Bill 2023, everything you need to know about what Treasury is proposing as far as taxation is concerned. Before we proceed to the issue of pay-to-play, James and Robert, let's go back to excise. And a very strange proposal around excise on winnings at 20%. Let's start with you, Robert. What are the specific proposals and what are the implications?
So, Julian, on excess duty on winnings, the proposal is to move that rate of excess duty from 7.5% to 20%. That's the first proposal. The second proposal is to say we are defining winnings now. So winnings is no longer just what you get over and above what you had put in as a stake as a punter, but it is the entire amount. So for example, if you put in a stake of 100 shillings and then you win, say 20 shillings, the odds are 1.2, so you win 120 shillings. The 120 shillings will be subject to 20% excess duty. Now, if you subject 120 shillings to excess duty, the excess duty is 24, yes. Which means that you should be getting the difference, which is about 96 or thereabouts. So what's the point of even betting? That's the first thing, and then the second thing obviously is the whole issue around the way the sector has been treated. If you look at the finance bills, I think from as early as 2016, yeah. I don't think that sector has failed to feature in a finance bill.
I agree.
Yeah. So, and this is what we're talking about, tax stability in terms of the tax environment. You want to create an enabling environment for these investors so that they can at least have predictable tax environment and ensure that they arrange their affairs in a predictable manner. And I really think that that's something that needs to be relooked at. Otherwise, there's no business for these guys.
We could kill the industry, effectively. James, I thought we ideally tax on gains. So where would this be coming from?
Yeah, and you see, that's the point. I think over and above these entities not being in business, especially for the small bets, because the punter really will be making a loss, like Robert has illustrated. And Robert is right. I don't think there's any budget cycle from 2016 where this has not featured.
True.
It fizzles out or it changes form by the time we have the Finance Act. As to what informs that decision is, we don't know. But then what I can say is this an attempt by the government to deal with the moral related issues on betting? Because it's a craze, it's an addiction.
Yeah.
And it has affected a lot of people negatively as a result. But then you see, it's sort of a catch-22 for government. Number one, they need the revenue. Number two, the issues related to the morality associated with betting and gambling and all those other gaming activities. But you see, if you look at other jurisdictions where this happens, a good example, the UK, it is under control. Why does it seem to be under control? Yes, there are those extreme cases of guys who've gone bust because of being addicted to gambling and betting, among them footballers. But then you see the question is, the government still needs the money from this. I don't really want to call it a sector. People always find it very offensive, saying that betting and gaming is a sector. But I think what normally happens, even in cases where winners have raked in the jackpots and substantial amounts, there's always an obligation these betting companies have. This might not be in the public domain. I think in the public domain, we'll just see someone being given a check. But by the time that process happens, especially for people who win jackpots, there's a whole panel of financial advisors who actually sit down with the person to advise the person on potential investment options that exist. So this debate about the balance between the morality of betting and gaming activities vis-a-vis the government's struggle to net some tax from the sector will never end. I don't think this is the last time we will see proposals to amend issues on gaming and betting tax. But I think what they are proposing is extreme, especially from the fact that the betting companies will not be allowed to net off the stakes versus the payouts. The issue of increasing the excise duty. Remember, these betting companies also pay betting tax that is under the BCLB Act. In addition to that, there's normally a percentage that they contribute towards a fund. So in actual sense, the betting companies actually pay a lot of money. It's not that I'm really advocating, but you see, it is something that we have. It is a reality we have to deal with. So that striking of the balance by the government is, I think, what they always grapple with every budget cycle. But I guess it's manageable in a way.
Okay. Let's switch gears. So the finance bill is proposing that if you want to dispute a tax matter between you and KRA, of course, then you must deposit at least 20%, no, 20%, yes, of the amount in dispute, or a security which is an equivalent of that. And we were having this discussion last year, if you recall, the Finance Bill 2022. And the argument was that, what does this mean for access to justice on tax dispute matters? Granted, last year it was 50%, now it's 20%. But Robert, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, Julian, just before we go into that question, I should also let your financial controller know that he'll be required to register for excess duty because there's excess duty on advertising and promotions. But yeah, to your question that you asked, this pay-to-play rules, as they are called, the reason why they're called pay-to-play is because for you to play in the appeal process, you need to pay. Now, I think what is informing that provision is government is looking at the amount of disputes that are held up at the tax appeals tribunal. And they're saying, hey guys, we need to do two things. We need to try and collect as much as possible. And two, we need to incentivize people to stop objecting to assessments, without any reasonable cause, in their view. And so they bring in these pay-to-play rules. Now, when you tell me, if you give me an assessment of, say, 100 million, and you tell me that I need to pay 20 million. 20 million. Several things arise. One, I'm already disputing that assessment, so why am I paying? And then two, I don't even have the money to pay, so I need to go and borrow from maybe the bank in order for me to pay. And then when I borrow, you'll then tell me about my interest expense exceeding a certain threshold, and therefore I cannot take. And I think as a country, we need to think about that particular provision, because by you putting that requirement, you're basically telling me if I can't raise that money, I cannot access justice.
Correct.
And I think that there's a real issue here. And we have to go back to history and find out, why was this proposal in the Finance Bill 2022 shot down by the parliamentarians when it went to debate? It is because of that issue of access to justice. I think that's a primary issue that we need to be addressing. And so for me, I think that that's not a good provision at all. And then we need to perhaps consider other alternatives of unlocking this money, alternative dispute resolution being one of them.
And I want to piggyback on your point. You mentioned two issues, and I have a third issue with this provision, James, as I bring you in. Why am I depositing funds with the commissioner when I'm in dispute with the very same commissioner? I mean, it does not make sense to me, James.
Can you allow me to laugh? Because, yeah, you cannot, to be honest, I think in terms of that administrative aspect, it really makes no sense that you're depositing that amount with, we normally call the commissioner the respondent.
Yes.
When he is party to the dispute.
To the dispute.
So that raises the very first question. But then again, maybe if I can just expound the reasoning as to why some of these cases are stuck at the Tax Appeals Tribunal, and generally the weakness with the entire tax litigation process, I think the problem starts with the commissioner himself, because there are certain assessments that can be raised on a taxpayer that are outrageous.
Yes.
And you see even the willingness by the taxpayer to sit and have a reasonable discussion on the assessment, that opportunity closes door and the taxpayer decides, you know what, let me fight this issue until the end. And this actually talks to the fact that I think there needs to be a paradigm shift with the way the Revenue Authority conducts its audits. By the time they decide that they're raising an assessment, it's also got to be an assessment that is reasonable. It's only that in this panel, like, we cannot share certain information, but there are certain assessments that come and you almost fall off your seat because, wow, it is outrageous. And you see the immediate reaction by the taxpayer is, it's okay. In as much as there are issues that I would wish to concede to, let me just object to this thing in its entirety and let me park it there. And we deal with it legally. So I think there just needs to be a very different approach as to how the KRA comes up with some of these assessments, because some of them are just outrageous. And you see, that's why it ends up being a very tricky situation for taxpayers, and decide, you know what, let's just go the full length, at least get precedence, because also if you water down the role of the Tax Appeals Tribunal or the courts, then we'll be looking at a situation in tax law where we don't have any precedence. If everyone goes to ADR, remember ADR is sort of an out of TAT settlement, which is not on a prejudice basis. There are certain concessions or considerations either party on the commissioner's side and the taxpayer will give. But you see, that can't be used outside the context of an ADR. But then if all cases went to ADR, what does it speak to towards coming up with precedence that is very, very important in coming up with certain determinations that will shape the entire tax regime.
And just for the sake of our viewers, when James talks about ADR, that's Alternative Dispute Resolution, and TAT is Tax Appeals Tribunal. James, this is mass media, so let's be on the same page. Still on the same issue, Robert. There was a proposal in the draft tax policy that we should have specialized courts dedicated to tax affairs. Would that be a way out?
That definitely would be a way out. And a perfect example of a jurisdiction where that has worked is in the UK. You know, in the UK, if you get an assessment, within 21 days, you have a resolution of your matter. So there is no need to even pay these deposits, because within 21 days, the tribunal will have ruled. And if you are unhappy, you can go to the next level, the High Court. And again, the High Court within 35 days will have ruled. So if you're looking at collecting taxes from a taxpayer, within 60 days, you've effectively collected the tax. Now, if you come to Kenya, I object, you give me an assessment, I object, and then you confirm the assessment, and then we go to the Tax Appeals Tribunal. I have 44 days before the matter can even go to the tribunal. So really, you've got just an additional 16 days if we were to have specialized courts to collect this money. So I think there's actually alternatives to this pay-to-play rule, because if you look at other jurisdictions where it's been employed, like in Tanzania, it's a real disaster. You know, generally, and James has made the point, you'll have overzealous revenue officers who have perhaps not met their target, giving you absurd assessments, and you have to pay the 20% in order for you to even try and resolve this issue. So I think really this is not, I wouldn't say that this is a good provision at all.
All right. Gentlemen, one of the group of people who have really been on my Twitter handle today are digital content creators. So let's start with you, James. I think it's 15% withholding?
Yes.
Your thoughts on that? How would that work?
Now, the fact is this. Digital content creators don't need to be up in arms to begin with.
Okay.
Because what they are doing is considered to be a business. Because a business is defined in tax law as that activity that you do basically repeatedly as a way to earn an income. So it is a business. And it is not that it has never been subject to tax. Now, I think with the developments in technology and the fact that now there's ready access to digital content, you see, remember, and the government is saying we need to increase the tax net.
Yeah.
And you'll be shocked. A lot of these content creators actually earn pretty good sums of money.
True.
So isn't it fair to
I
say
know
that,
some of them.
isn't it fair to say that they need then to contribute towards payment of tax? The answer is yes. So it's not really a new tax. It's only that then there needs to be modalities as to how the government can be able to implement taxation of that content, because there is income that is being earned along the way. But then you'll notice the quick escalation of the government's focus on taxing the digital economy.
Correct.
I think we started with DST. And Kenya took this unilateral approach and said we will do 1.5% on any digital service tax provider or any person who has a digital marketplace. So that started with a variation a couple of years down that this is only applicable to non-resident persons,
Yes.
which made sense because resident persons anyway would be required to pay taxes on any income from digital services. Now, in this budget cycle, there's a proposal to add something else called digital asset tax. So, so there seems to be a lot of provisions that are touching on the digital economy.
Yes.
With also a lot of confusion on how some of these digital assets will be taxed. And digital assets, particularly what seems to be of focus
is crypto.
Is the crypto,
yes,
and NFTs.
Yeah.
And actually, if you look at the government's intention to come up with this proposal, something that preceded this proposal was a requirement by CBK to come up with some regulations for all those guys in the crypto space. So you can actually see this is not a knee-jerk reaction from government. There has been consideration. And you see, I think the first thing they wanted to do is, let's come up with a regulator through the CBK. Let's have some form of registration, some form of stock take on all these basically digital assets and digital services. Then we can come up with the legislation.
I see.
Yeah.
All right. And once again, NFTs, non-fungible tokens. James.
Okay.
We are really running out of time. But Robert, help us now on this side. There are two things now. We have digital services tax and we have digital assets tax. Help us distinguish the two.
So digital services tax is the tax that is levied on the income that an owner of a platform which enables exchange people to trade. So that's the digital services tax that James is talking about at 1.5%. Then digital assets, the Act has defined, in very, very broad terms what digital assets are, and like James says, the main focus is cryptocurrencies. And now the Act is saying, when you realize a value out of a transaction from this digital asset, we want to collect 3% tax on that. Yeah. And the key thing to note there is that it's 3% on the transfer value. It's not a question of gain. And like James says, I think we need a coherence of policy, because if you look at the Capital Markets Bill 2023,
the amendment bill.
Yes, the amendment bill.
Yes.
There was a proposal to tax this same assets, 1.5%, and depending on whether it's capital gains tax or income tax. So I think there's a need for coherence there. But clearly, KRA, or let me say the executive, has woken up to the potential of this particular issue. And just one point on content creation, the withholding tax rate is 15%. That is very high for resident or for local rates, because we're usually used to 3 to 5%. So when you talk about 15%, it's really on the higher side.
Gentlemen, we have only 3 minutes to go, and I'd like to get your closing remarks. And to give your closing remarks, please respond to this. Everyone is asking, can your panelists please comment on the 3% deduction towards the housing fund? We have increased NSSF, we have increased NHIF, now housing fund. Is the pay rate effectively at 40%, James?
I share the sentiments of the person who has asked the question, because this will affect all of us.
Yeah.
And you see, the question is, number one, will there be value for all these deductions that are coming through? That's the first question. Because you would want a situation, and that's why in the West, they don't have a problem with paying very high taxes, because
there's value for money.
You don't go back to your pocket to incur costs on the same things that are being covered by the taxes that are being paid. And this is just to put things into perspective, because this is in the public domain and it's the reality. With the small NHIF contributions that we make, there is still an issue with NHIF. Yeah. So where will the accountability of these additional deductions, who will be held accountable as to basically the use of these deductions? It will come with an extra pinch in the pocket, which is something really that the government should look at, because we are grappling with inflation, very harsh economic times, but you still want to eat into the pockets, so people will end up with lower disposable income. So aren't we shooting ourselves in the foot?
James, I have 1 minute. Let me get this guy to give his thoughts on the same.
Okay, so number one on the NHIF and NSSF and all those. So I think actually the effective tax rate is higher than 40%, because remember the employer is also contributing 3%.
Yes.
Housing. So you're talking about 44%. Now the key thing that I just wanted to highlight here, Julians, is the VAT. VAT on fuel. I think there's a big issue in that amendment, because the 8% rate on fuel seems to have been deleted. Which suggests that we are going back to 16%. Now, that's a big issue. And so I think there's a lot of debate that needs to come into this document. I know there's a lot of analysis that is going to go into this, and I'd encourage everybody who is watching us to give their comments, because that's how we're going to come up with a good Finance Act 2023. Thank you.
Gentlemen, I wish we had 2 hours to unpack all this, but one final comment from a viewer here is that your panel is extremely unfair to content creators. I assure you that's not the point. We're just bringing out the issues as they are and trying to illuminate what the conversation should be. We shall continue covering the Finance Bill 2023 into next week. And remember, the most important thing is that you will have a window for public participation where you can send your comments to the National Treasury. As an active citizen, I challenge you to send your comments to the National Treasury on all the proposals in the Finance Bill 2023. By the time we're getting to the Act on June 30th, let's have an Act that is favorable to the business environment. News is up next with Ben Kitili. Stay tuned.
This is N.